In 1941, the Houghton Mifflin Company published a book destined to become an American classic. James Agee, the writer, and Walker Evans, the photographer, had created a work that was powerful and demanding. Let us now praise famous men. Fewer than 600 copies were sold. The book went out of print for the rest of James Agee's life. Reissued in 1960, it received instant critical acclaim, and for many readers became an important experience, a moral touchstone, a favorite book. This film is about the life and the work of James Agee, a sovereign prince of the English language.
I don't know exactly why I like the book so much. One of the reasons is that the life that he wrote about was almost exactly the life that I knew. We were not as poor, but my neighbors were, and his detailed description of the most specific occurrences or observations of his and his projection on a universal basis of the suffering and destitution of people who were afflicted by poverty really touched my heart. Also, his writing style, I thought was a lot like Henry David Thoreau, whom I've always admired very much. And his sensitivity and his personal injection of himself into the scene or the person's life that he described, I thought was unique compared to anything I had ever read. I believe he added a new dimension to descriptive literature. And another thing that I liked was that perhaps it wasn't appreciated very much when it was first published, but I think it's a major classic. But I didn't know all those things when I liked it. I just liked it.
Let Us Now Praise Famous Men has been called the centerpiece of James Agee's work. It can be appreciated best when seen in the context of his life, beginning at the beginning in the mountains of Tennessee.
We're talking now of summer evenings in Knoxville, Tennessee, in the time that I lived there, so successfully disguised to myself as a child. The blue night blacks above. Lamps bloom in their glasses, and the stars splinter and glister glass. Tell me, was ever love so gentle in the hand, so tender in the eye? Was ever love more lovely to the loved? All my people are larger bodies than mine, quiet, with voices gentle and meaningless, like the voices of sleeping birds. One is an artist, he is living at home. One is a musician, she is living at home. One is my mother, who is good to me. One is my father, who is good to me. By some chance, here they are, all on this earth. And who shall ever tell the sorrow of being on this earth, lying on quilts, on the grass, in the summer evening among the sounds of night? After a little, I am taken in and put to bed. Sleep, soft, smiling, draws me unto her. And those receive me who quietly treat me as one familiar and well-beloved in that home, but will not, oh, will not now, not ever, but will not ever tell me who I am.
I don't know whether I can make very much a very good description. I would say I like children, and certainly those that are intelligent and interesting and can talk can be very charming companions. And that was the case with him. He had been quite a good deal in the home of his grandfather, his mother's father, whose name was Joel Tyler, and that would mean classics and literature, and they both of them knew quite a fair amount about music, and thoroughly cultivated people. They had not come from upper class financially, but they were cultivated people. And so he had been in a home where there were books and periodicals and discussion of things and music and such as that. And he'd read quite a bit at that time. And so we immediately became friends, and I loved to talk with him, and he would talk about books that he'd read, and he'd read some of Booth Tarkington and various books that he was perfectly willing to talk about and describe, and had a number of interests, and so we got to be just dear friends. I just loved him. Not quite 10 years old, and this engaging little boy.
Jim's mother was deeply religious, and from 2 years after her husband's death, she spent the months of each academic year at St. Andrews on the Cumberland Plateau in Tennessee, a little community and school associated with a monastic order in the Episcopal Church.
That is, the place was definitely founded as a Christian enterprise. That is, there was classes in religious instruction, and they went to chapel or morning prayers, and then evening prayers after supper, and the Angelus was rung from the monastery bell, and the boys were encouraged to participate in the religion to whatever degree their conscience would permit. Some of them came from an intensely Protestant background, like the Southern Baptists and so on. And so I remember one of the boys speaking to me once, and he said, I hadn't never been in a Catholic church till I come here, and the first Sunday I just didn't know what it was all about. I went in there to go to church, and I thought that, well, like what I was used to, the preacher would come in and start to raring and stampeding. And instead of that, he found this liturgical service with the high mass sung and the liturgical forms, and no raring and stampeding at all.
Jim later wrote a short novel dealing with the experiences of a young boy during the night-long vigil before Good Friday. Names are changed, but the setting is unmistakably St. Andrews.
Now it was the deepest hour of the night. Judas, gliding, had stretched against that clear face his serpent smile. Peter, in loyal rage, had struck off the dazed servant's ear, and he, in quiet, had healed him, and without struggle had yielded himself into their hands. By now he stood peaceful before Pilate, the one calm and silence, amid all that tumult of malice and scorn and guile and hatred and beating of unhabitual light through all the sleepless night of spring. Soon now the sentence and the torment, the scourging, the mocking robe, the wreathed wretched crown, a deep, deep hour. It has happened over 1,900 times now, and yet it has never happened before. He is waiting. This is his last night, and his last daybreak begins soon. Before this day is over, he will be dead. My Jesus, he whispered, you are dying for me, and I can't do anything for you. I can thank you. I can think about you. I can try to know what you're going through for me. My Lord, I love thee. My Lord, I grieve for thee. My dear Lord, I adore thee. My poor Lord, I wish I could suffer for thee. My Lord, I thank thee. Lord, have mercy upon me. Christ, have mercy upon me. Lord, have mercy upon me. He was waiting, and he was now within his last hours. He won't see the sun go down today. Tonight, he whispered, this very night, this minute. Goodbye, his soul whispered. It is finished. Now that they had stopped running and stood in the brightened silence of the open light, the day began to look practical. They realized how chilly the air still was and how bitter the water looked, and they no longer felt like going in. But none of them was willing to admit this frankly, even to himself. There was no longer any chance of holding back. He had just time to dedicate himself. For thee. It was so cold that in the first moment he had felt almost unconscious, but now that he searched from ledge to ledge downward, there sprang throughout his flesh such an ardent and serene energy that he was aware of the entire surface of his body as if it were fire, and he wished he need never come up, and lay against the deepest trench of the bottom, his belly floundering in ooze. "O Lord, let me suffer with you this day," he prayed, his lungs about to burst, and he held himself down until he knew he could not reach the air in time. It became harder with every pulse to hold on to the rocks, but still he fought off his need for air. "For thee," he groaned. "Get out," he shouted silently, and leapt upward through the brightening water and cried out to himself, "I didn't have the nerve, and anyhow I tried," and broke the surface. I could have died, he realized. Here I am. The world was delicately silent. All the noise was within his own head and was rapidly dying. All that he saw twitched with his own pulse, and beating like a heart, the sun stood up.
There's a beautiful little passage of a few lines in the book called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, of a description of himself as serving at an early mass. You may remember that. I remember it begins, "I can recall how as a child, in the innocence of faith, I used to bring myself out of bed through the cold, lucid water of the Cumberland morning and serve at the altar at earliest lonely mass, whose words were thrilling brooks of music and whose motions a grave dance. And here, between spread hands, among words, the body and blood of Christ was created and lifted before God in a threshing of triplicate bells." Serving at early mass, and he served for me just that way many times at early mass. And it was impressionable, and yes, and we used to call him Socrates. That is, he was very intelligent, and he used good English, and he had quite a fund of information, and somehow or other the idea got right, oh, he knows a lot of things, and so they nicknamed him Socrates, the wise man of Greece. But I wasn't aware of his doing any writing that would be noticed until the summer that we went to Europe together, and he was to enter Phillips Exeter that fall. And then the first letters from Exeter, why immediately you see his interest in writing and belonging to the Lantern Club and writers that they get, and I hope I can get some things into the magazine. But I wasn't aware in his earlier days that he had any particular gift for writing or taste for it.
He was not what one would call a typical college student by any means. The first thing I was aware of was an enormous energy. He walked with tremendous vigor and kind of whistled in an excited way and thrust his head about and so on. He was a person of enormous energy, and that was certainly an early impression, an immediate impression. And another was that there was a certain mystery about him that I think everyone who ever met him felt and realized, sensed right at the very start of that friendship, that sometimes some people would find it amusing. I mean, just a rather a funny thing, because it was so, there was a quality about him that it was unpredictable. He would say he was going out for a walk on a winter night, and he would go out and disappear maybe for 2 days. And no one ever asked him where he had been.
It's been the most extraordinary and grand 3 months of my life, everything going continuously at top speed, mind, body, and nerves, and with an intensity I've never known before, with powers, pain, and joy all humming at once, with everything terrifically actual, yet abstracted and clear as glass. An average of 3.5 hours sleep per night, 2 or 3 meals per day, the rest of time, work, or time spent with friends. About 3 nights a week, I've talked all night, usually with Via.
I think Jim was the kind of guy who really fitted in with any age, you know, because, I mean, we were somewhat older. And, but we saw an awful lot of him and some of his friends in college. They'd come over and have meals, and we'd sit up talking and have a wonderful time.
What did people talk about? Did you recall that?
Oh, I wouldn't have any idea what did you talk all night about? Or do you?
Well,
I don't know, just all kinds of things. I couldn't possibly repeat that.
Yeah.
I suppose we talked quite a lot about literature and ideas and about ourselves and about movies and psychoanalysis and kinds of things.
Psychoanalysis?
Probably. He was very interested in that, you know.
No, I didn't know that at all.
Well, he thought he'd like to be one at one point.
November 19, 1930, Dear Father Fly. So far as I can tell, I definitely want to write. Nothing else holds me in the same way. I had 2 other interests just as strong a few years ago, music and directing movies. Last spring, I was all but ready to quit college and bum to California and trust to luck for the rest. But from now on, I'm committed to writing with a horrible definiteness. In fact, it amounts to a rather unhealthy obsession. I'm thinking about it every waking minute in one way or another, and my head is spinning and often dull with the continuous overwork. It sounds conceited, but I'd do anything on earth to become a really great writer. That's as sincere a thing as I've ever said. Do you see, though, where it leads me?
He graduated from Harvard in 1932. That was the depth of the Depression. And as you know, he was a man of no money like myself, poor boy. And I had happened to get a job, unfortunately, in 29, and had been working there for 3 years. And so Agee, with whom I've been in correspondence since 27 and seen a certain amount of, told me he needed a job, and I talked to Ralph Ingersoll, the editor of Fortune, and Ingersoll was very receptive to the idea and said, oh, yes, I know about Agee. And then it turned out that it was really Luce who knew about Agee, because Agee had done for the Harvard Advocate, they had done a parody issue of Time, and Luce had been very much impressed by it. And so I guess they gave him the usual, you know, had to write some tests and stuff, but Agee could write anything, you know, with his left hand. And so he was hired. And he was there much too long, of course.
August 1932. When you get down here again, I'll have my phonograph working in my office to play at night. An empty skyscraper is just about an ideal place for it. Something attracts me very much about playing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony there, with all New York about 600 feet below you, and with that swell ode taking in the whole earth, and with everyone on earth supposedly singing it, and all except joy forgotten.
And we find that the President-elect of the United States has proceeded slowly down before the eyes of 100,000 admiring spectators to the flourishes and the ruffles of the United States Marine Band and to the music of the Hail to the Chief. For the nation's new executive will shortly become the honorary commander-in-chief of the United States Marine Band, the President's own. And there he is directly before the lectern.
My friends, this is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly. Only a foolish optimist can deny the dark realities of the moment. Farmers find no market for their produce, and the savings of many years in thousands of families are gone. A host of unemployed citizens face the grim problem of existence, and an equally great number toil with little return. Primarily, this is because the rulers of the exchange of mankind's goods have failed through their own stubbornness and their own incompetence. They have no vision, and when there is no vision, the people perish.
And then we got married in January of '33. And then we got this nice apartment on Perry Street. Started living there, and that was a very, very nice. It was a two-room basement apartment with a yard, and in the spring we put pansies into it and everything. And we used the porch and lived outdoors a great deal. Just the kind of thing that was just nice when you didn't have much money. You didn't need any more room than that. And Jim was starting in with Fortune. And of course, I can't remember what he would have been doing at the beginning.
As I said, he could write about anything, really. But he couldn't write about business. That was one trouble. Unfortunately, it was supposed to be a business magazine. So after a couple of years, when he wrote all these, well, we used to call it rich, beautiful prose, you know, he wrote these kind of articles on the 10 most precious jewels in the world, private islands, luxury cruises, furs, and you can imagine what he'd do with furs, you know, with all kinds of sadomasochism. Everything was in there, yeah. He'd bring a tremendous cultural weight to it, and also he would write with this extremely brilliant and marvelous incantatory style, rich, beautiful prose. Then one day, Luce noticed that he had written no business articles. Well, we all try to get out of writing business articles, but, you know, I, being a more of a normal hack journalist, was able to do it and did do it. So he assigned Agee an article on the price of steel rails. And his point was that they hadn't changed since 1892 per ton, not even by 1 penny. And this is an example of monopoly pricing, obviously. And he edited it himself. He said, I'm gonna make Agee into a business writer. Well, Agee couldn't understand why this was of any interest, you know. And Luce would say, but, you know, Jim, don't you realize since 1892 there hasn't been a change in the price of steel rails? And Agee would say, well, yes, so, you know, expecting something more. Well, there wasn't any more.
October 1933, Dear Father Fly. The editor-in-chief was much impressed by my Tennessee Valley story, one of the best pieces of writing he'd ever seen in Fortune. He was as honest and swell as anyone could wish for, but what it will profit me to become a good economist, I don't see. If I had as much confidence about writing as I have intention, everything might be much easier. I feel the well-known prison walls distinctly thickening.
Jim was so stimulating that he was surrounded with people all the time. There were friends who always wanted to come and see him. And preferably they'd sit up very late at night talking. We all would. And then Jim was on that rhythm of a person who doesn't want to get up in the morning and wakes up at about 12 and has a little breakfast, and then he'd go up to the office. And he'd come back very late in the afternoon. And then if he had company at all or felt like it, we'd get talking in the evening and get more and more bright and stimulating as the evening went on. This is, you know that rhythm. People are very different in their rhythms that way. I'm a morning person, so. But I just remember that that's what he did.
His mode of talking and conversation has been described many times. Could you describe it?
Yes, I could, and would be delighted to. It was, for one thing, very physical. The hands came in very much. He had in his mind a sense of form, and the form that he wanted to give to his discourse, he was also, so to speak, putting in the air with his hands, his fingers, and so on. One felt that what he was saying was reinforced by his whole body. He was talking with it, and in particular with his hands and arms.
He was always, shaping things. Oh God, he was terrific. Yeah, he couldn't talk without his hands at all. And, well, I would say that he was interesting because, in one sense, he was a monologuist. He would get going on something. But in another way, though, if you insisted on bringing up things, if you had an argument with him, if you insisted on interrupting him, he would be able to deal with your arguments. I mean, he wasn't just a rhapsodizer. He was an interesting combination of somebody like Thomas Wolfe, who really didn't have much brains, really. He was simply a gusher. And Agee was that, too. But Agee also had the T.S. Eliot, or the hard, critic, intellectual side to him, too.
So when you were talking with Jim and the conversation was serious, you were involved in what I suppose from an objective point of view, from someone who was looking through a window, would have seemed a performance, really. And, of course, he did also have histrionic ability. He was wonderful at parodying certain kinds of voice, Tennessee hillbilly voice, for example, applied to the recitation of a poem by Shelley. Imagine. When the lamp is shattered, the light and the dust lies dead. And that kind of thing.
The worst thing was that he simply couldn't, once he got seated in a place, whether it was his own or some other guy's place in some house, my God, it would be 3, 4 o'clock, and Agee was still there with a few devoted souls, and there was no chance of their ever leaving, he simply couldn't, he couldn't define himself. That was his main trouble, I think, as a writer, too, that he couldn't limit himself. He was oceanic, And in a way, that was his great strength, too.
There was no moderation ever possible, The man was immoderate in every way. He was, his interests were immoderately wide, his intellect was immoderately intense, and his passions were immoderately large. And this was true, at Harvard, and became even truer, I think, in New York and later.
I learned how to make scenes from Jim because I was brought up not to cry and not to get angry and all that. So I thought, if Jim's going to do it, I'll do it too. So we'd have scenes, and then we'd both feel a great deal better. But just a very lively, extraordinary temperament to live with, and full, I think, some of it sort of torture, really.
October 1934. I'm in most possible kinds of pain, mental and spiritual. The trouble revolves chiefly around the simple-sounding problem of how to become what I wish I could when I can't. That, however, is fierce and complicated enough to keep me balancing over suicide, as you might lean out over the edge of a high building. My ideas and impressions and desires, which are much larger than I can begin to get to paper, are loose in my brains like wild beasts, not devouring each other, but in the process of tearing the zoo apart. plans for work, a collection of letters of all sorts, a story about homosexuality and football, notes for color photography, a newsreel theater, a new type of stage screen show about motherhood, 3 or 4 love stories, a new type of sex book, a study in the pathology of laziness, a new form of movie short, roughly equivalent to the lyric poem, prophetic writing, the angriest and most incisive possible, a true account of a jazz band, a new kind of photographic show, a sort of static movie, a new kind of music, non-instrumental, an autobiographical novel, new forms of poetry, a notebook.
We would, of course, think and talk about other possibilities beyond journalism. And one of them was that of being a forest ranger. I think he was attracted by that kind of thing. And if he had done that, the results might have been very interesting. If he had given himself that kind of isolation and that kind of time, he might have done a great deal more writing of his own, I mean, during the years when he was grinding it out for Luce. And another thing that I remember we became very interested in was news that the government was selling a lot of old lighthouses, no longer needed along the coast. And wouldn't it be great, you know, if we could muster enough money to buy a lighthouse and move there to get away from the world, and New York in particular. Well, of course, we never did.
Oh, no, I think the writing was like a master in his life. It was just somebody, writing was what he was serving. That's what you felt. He couldn't get away from it. And I think there was a lot of trying to escape, you know, like the drinking, I think, partly, and probably all the people and the talk. This is part, but he needed all that. I mean, that was natural to him. But it's partly, I think, that it was a very strong, constant thing in his life, was that he was going to write, and write well. It was the thing. When I was married to him, I thought, well, nothing should interfere with this, if possible, you know, and to set it up that way. Not interrupt it and not take his mind off it when it was going well and all that. Keep distractions out, you know, a wife doing that kind of thing. You can see it. Keep it quiet for him.
You weren't successful, though.
Well, I don't think sometimes I probably was.
When you recommend Let Us Now Praise Famous Men to your friends, what do you tell them?
I generally warn them about it. And I said, look, just relax and read the book like it's poetry. And think about the 3 or 4 or 5 years that Agee spent trying to describe in vivid and beautiful terms his impressions of common, ordinary human beings. And if they're interested in art, I remind them of the early paintings of Vincent van Gogh, who went into destitute miners' homes and who painted in his early life scenes like the Potato Eaters, which is a stark, almost worshipful picture of extremely poor people, and the worth of human beings is, I think, the thing that comes across in Agee's life. And the other thing that impresses me is his embarrassment, his reticence about intruding on these people who were so weak and unsure of themselves that they would not have excluded him even if they wanted to. He felt like he was maybe a dominant figure. He wanted to be so careful not to disturb their lives, not only because he didn't want to paint a false picture of how they lived, but also just because he respected them and cared about them and felt that their privacy was one of the few precious possessions that they had that was all their own.
It was unforgettable. He came to my office door. Robert, have you got a moment? Swallowing hard. He must just come down from upstairs where he had been given this assignment. And he was terribly excited, and told me that not only were they going to send him to Alabama on this story, but that they were going to allow him to have Walker Evans, which was, I guess, a degree of generosity and taste on their part that he hadn't expected. Anyway, the prospect of going to Alabama with Evans, whose work he so much admired, tremendously excited him. And nothing would do, but we had to knock off work at once and go over to a bar on 3rd Avenue to have some beers and talk it over.
June 18, 1936. Dear Father, I must cut this short and do a week's work in the next 20 hours or so. I've been assigned to do a story on a sharecropper family, daily and yearly life, and also a study of farm economics in the South. The best break I ever had on Fortune. Feel terrific personal responsibility towards story. Considerable doubts of my ability to bring it off. Considerable more doubts of Fortune's ultimate willingness to use it. We'll be starting South Saturday for a month's work.
Well, I think he knew in his bones that this was going to be something big for him, you know. He knew that given a month or 2 months in the Deep South, looking into the lives of the impoverished was going to electrify a great deal of his nature that had not yet, you know, that had been perhaps never given an opportunity for full expression or for full employment. That this was going to test him and all that he had, much more than anything that had ever come up before. So he was scared, too. And he said, you know, he was scared clean through of facing this thing. All the moral, physical, intellectual questions that this would bring up with a man as sensitive and as complicated as Jim Agee were suddenly activated, do you see? And he knew that afternoon that it was going to be a great thing for him.
During July and August 1936, Walker Evans and I were traveling in the middle south of this nation and were engaged in what even from the first seemed to me a curious piece of work. It was our business to prepare for a New York magazine an article on cotton tenantry, as examined in the daily living of 3 representative white tenant families. We had first to find and to live with such a family, and that was the object of our traveling. More essentially, this is an independent inquiry into certain normal predicaments of human divinity. If complications arise, that is because we are trying to deal with it not as journalists, sociologists, politicians, entertainers, humanitarians, priests, or artists, but seriously. Down in front of the courthouse, Walker had picked up Talk With You, Fred Ricketts. And then 2 men came up and stood shyly a little away, Bud Woods and George Gudger. We drove you out home, and there on the side porch of the house, Walker made pictures with the big camera. And we sat around and talked, eating the small, sweet peaches and drinking the warm and fever-tasting water from the cistern sunk beneath the porch. And we kept you from your dinners an hour at least. There you all are, the mother as before a firing squad, the children like columns of an exquisite temple, and behind, both girls bent deep in the dark shadow, somehow as if listening, and as in a dance, attending their hair. I can remember it so clearly as if it were 5 minutes ago, when the whole time was like one chord and shock of music.
Now, as far as how they found us, I couldn't say. First thing we knew, they came up and introduced themselves and told us where they were from. And then he got to taking pictures. Walker did. And he was writing down little things, you know. At the start, it was kind of a little hard for us to understand them. But now, I'm going to tell you, there wasn't any harm said. There wasn't anybody made fun of them or anything. You could understand them, but they just sounded funny. I asked Mr. Jimmy. I said, what kind of a sound is your voice got? He says, that is a northern kind of talk. I couldn't understand. He says, that's just that northern talk. He says, all of them up there is like that. But you know, when they left here, they had done got to where they was talking our kind of talk.
Although I did pick up the family first, I think it's really largely because they liked Agee. He had a great gift of making people not only like him but love him, and they only had to listen to him a little bit and then took him in. I didn't identify myself subjectively nearly as much as Agee did. I was working objectively on the visual material in front of me, which was incredibly rich. If you're young and interested, as we were, you throw yourself into work like that without any thought of sparing yourself, without any thought of the time invested or energy either. That is work at its best, the way all work ought to be. It seldom is.
Well, the big piece, you know, big bugs around mountains, they're real safe. They would tell the men, you know, that they were spies from Russia, and they was trying to get all they could out of the United States, you know. You know how, I don't know what spies does, dear, but anyway, we know that they wasn't going to hurt us no way. And they didn't. Well, they stayed there with us. They eat with us and everything, dear. I fix their breakfast every morning, their supper every night. We just have a lot of fun around the table, you know. They was just like us. They was just common people. Of course, I know they had plenty, but they was good mixers. He would stay around the house with me and see what I done, you know. Like I churned to make the butter, you know. They couldn't understand how I done that. And he'd stay around there and watch me put up the milk and watch me milk and what I'd do every morning when I first get up, you know, and follow me all day. And then he'd come back in the book, you know, what he had done. I don't care what they done with the books and things. If they got rich off it, it's all right with me. It was the truth. To tell you the truth about it, when they left you, I hated to see them go. I could have cried if it would have done any good, because I got attached to them.
All that surrounded me, that silently strove in through my senses and stretched me full, was familiar and dear to me as nothing else on earth, and as if well known in a deep past and long years lost. For half my blood is just this, and half my right of speech, and by bland chance alone is my life so softened and sophisticated. And so all the time we have stayed in this house, and in all we have sought, and in each detail of it, there is so keen, sad, and precious a nostalgia as I can scarcely otherwise know. A knowledge of brief truancy into the sources of my life.
Well, I saw him as soon as he got back, of course, and I realized, and we all realized, that it had been, as one could have foreseen, a shaking kind of experience for him to take part as he had in these lives. Jim Agee was a Christian, and a profound one. And these were the lives of people who were, as one might say, the least of the Lord's people. So deep was their poverty, and so hopeless was their life and their lot. And he had gone down from relative security and relative comfort to face all this.
The trip was very hard, and certainly one of the best things that ever happened to me. Writing what we found is a different matter, impossible in any form fortune can use. As you may have had wind of, Via and I are divorcing. I am here with Alma Mailman, whom you may, but more likely do not know.
He wanted to work, and he wanted the quiet and peace of mind, and wanted to get out of the city. And we found a house in Frenchtown, New Jersey, and we set up housekeeping. We were in love. And it was something else, too. It was kind of we met each other on other levels, I think. First we met each other on music, which was very, very, very clear. It was, we really did meet on music, and it wasn't just that we played together or talked about music or went to concerts or played music. It was, we understood something about that we met on music which didn't need to be talked about. And there was something, we met on a religious basis, which is also, we shouldn't use the word for. Also wanted to be with me, I wanted to be with him, and we went to Frenchtown. And we had a wood frame house with an upstairs and a downstairs and a backyard, and a big coal stove in the kitchen. And we were like two kids playing house. And the first thing that happened was Walker Evans coming with a crate of Scotch whiskey.
And
at any rate, it was we lived, and mostly he worked at night. And during the day, when he wasn't working, we played. Played tennis, piano. He played tennis the way he played piano.
How was that?
Well, without any technique, but brilliant when it hit off. You know, when he did get a drive over, no one could get it back. Mm-hmm. And he played piano that way too. And we used to draw each other too. And you get to know each other when you play music together or draw each other. And
except for endless and awful delays in the finishing of the book, living is just now about perfectly good. I wish that all elements of such a situation could hold, not stand still, but another kind of hold, and that time ran slower.
He'd finish writing and then read whatever he'd written. And I thought everything he wrote was marvelous. I had no sense of criticism. He'd feel good about it, and then about 2 or 3 in the morning, we'd get into the car and go for a ride. And we'd ride, go over the dirt roads around Frenchtown. It was nice, and I'd get out on the running board, and he'd go as fast as he could. It was nice. Jim was 2 people, as I think now. The Harvard graduate, and he was the tenant farmer, a farmer, and I reacted to the farmer. I liked the big, clumsy, awkward, sensitive guy.
August 12, 1938. Dear Father, my writing is in bad shape. The past 5 weeks have been completely sterile. My trouble is that such a subject cannot be seriously looked at without intensifying itself toward a center which is beyond what I or anyone else is capable of writing of, the whole problem and nature of existence. Well, there's no use trying to talk about it. If I could make it what it ought to be made, I would not be human. I wish I might see you, and I wish this book was done. Here at a center is a creature. It would be our business to show how through every instant of every day of every year of his existence alive, he is from all sides streamed inward upon, bombarded, pierced, destroyed by that enormous sleeting of all objects, forms, and ghosts, how great, how small, no matter. We try to suggest his incomparable tenderness to experience, the almost unimaginable nakedness, the size, the abomination of the crimes he is to sustain, against the incredible sweetness, strength, and beauty of what he might be and is cheated of. For one who sets himself to look at all earnestly into the living eyes of a human life, what is it he there beholds that so freezes and abashes his ambitious heart? What is it, profound behind the outward windows, drawn tightly back at bay against the backward wall and blackness of its prison cave, so that the eyes alone shine of their own angry glory, but the eyes of a trapped wild animal, or a furious angel nailed to the ground by his wings, or however else one may faintly designate the human soul, that which is angry, that which is untamable, that which is healthful and holy.
When I left for Mexico, it was after a dreadful year. It was after Joel was born. And Joel's birth meant a change in Jim's and my life, because Jim's way of living and working continued. He slept as long as he felt like, stayed up talking during the night, worked. And I almost overnight became a mother and responsible for a baby, and I almost didn't see him anymore. And I became different. I had a baby. And I don't think Jim changed. He still loved me, but I was different. And then there was a situation which happened, which came with Mia. And this conflict went out. I guess maybe he wanted both. I don't know what. I know that I couldn't take the situation and the baby, and then after about a year of this, which involved lots of, 2 or 3 attempts on my part to run and being pulled back, attempts at suicide of Jim's, but not serious ones, I don't think, but just histrionic displays. And then Helen Levitt and I went to Mexico, and it wasn't the last time I saw Jim, but I remember we went on the Grace lines, and I remember Helen and I and Jim coming to say goodbye with us. Was an cold April day, and his coat open and tears running down his face. It's a sweet and painful memory of him.
December 1940. Everyone I see, myself included, is at a low, grinding ebb of quiet desperation. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the average experience of people living as people shouldn't, doing what people shouldn't, where people shouldn't, and little or nothing of what people should. Journalists, hacks, husbands, wives, sisters, neurotics, self-harmed artists, and such. Average New York fall. The book is supposed to be published in January or February. I want to be through with it and to get to work again as soon as I can. I am 31 now, and I can conceivably forgive myself the last 10 years only by a devotion to work in the next 10, which I suspect I will be incapable of. I'm much too vulnerable to human relationships. In short, I'm easily upset, and when upset, incapable of decent work. Incapable of it also when I'm not upset enough.
He always wrote. I mean, he always wrote. So I can't really, doesn't mean that he wouldn't take, he wouldn't, Jim never took a day off, basically. If we did something else during the day or the evening or so, then he would come home and sit down and start writing. I mean, he would never have a full 24 hours without doing some writing. Never.
He didn't take vacations?
No. Or if he took vacations, it was in order to write. It meant, being free of having to work for time or having to work for whoever. A vacation was time for him to do his own writing.
I remember, in fact, one great scene at time. His office was a huge chaos of old newspapers, books, letters, an open correspondence, and so on. And when he came in to work, he would literally burrow a kind of clearing in this tremendous mess on the desk. I mean, clear himself, say, 4 square feet of space, and on which then the yellow pad or yellow paper, a bunch of it would be put down, and the pencils, sharpened pencils. Then one had the impression of enormous force being concentrated, literally like a beam of light, on this small space that he had cleared away, and the world otherwise vanished because it was all concentrated there. His mind, his whole being, his physical being, concentrated on what he was writing, so that one had the feeling that it was a real solid shaft of intellectual light, you know, falling from this rather frowning brow down on the paper in front of him. Very impressive exhibition. After a while, since he was seeing the movies, since he had a lot more to say about them than he could possibly say in 2 or 3 columns of time, The Nation gave him a job or allowed him, I think every other week, a page or so on which he could say what he wanted to say about the movies. And this led then in time to his going to Hollywood and all the rest of it.
I suspect that I'm in your own situation, deeply interested in moving pictures, considerably experienced from childhood on in watching them and talking about them, and totally without experience of how they are made. It's my business to conduct one end of a conversation as an amateur critic among amateur critics. I would talk to even so good a director as John Ford, with deep respect for him as a technician and as a serious man, but I might at the same time regret 99 feet in every 100 of The Grapes of Wrath, and be able to specify my regret. Frankly, I doubt I'm qualified to arrive at any sensible assessment of Miss Elizabeth Taylor. Ever since I first saw the child, I've been choked with the peculiar sort of adoration I might have felt if we were in the same grade of primary school. Casablanca is still reverently spoken of as 1, fun, or 2, a real movie. I still think it is the year's clearest measure of how willingly people will deceive themselves. Only a MASH note or the work of several weeks could contain my regard for Groucho. In the Hollywood sense, I suppose The Song of Bernadette is a nearly perfect picture. I would about as soon see all that kind of skill and devotion used in embroidering the complete text of the Solemnization of Matrimony on a pair of nylon drawers. Open City goes far in what I believe is the best direction movies might take. I mean that the story needs to be passionately felt and intimately understood, and that it needs to be a story worthy of such knowledge and passion. But if you foresee how few years remain before the grandest prospect for a major popular art since Shakespeare's time dissolves into the ghastly nirvana of television, I think you'll find the work of this last year enough to shrivel the heart.
Well, I think as a critic that he suffers from the fact that he really wanted to be a creator. So therefore, I think his criticism, which I think is extremely good, is good because he has a broad cultural background, because he has a great style. He can say things in 2 sentences, you know. He has intelligence, wit, and precision. And also because he really does have a sense of values, and he didn't, he didn't give them up. But I think that as a person who wanted to be a creator, he kept seeing in movies all kinds of things that really weren't there. You see, I'm a critic. I'm a non-creative critic, and I've always have been. I never wanted to write anything fictional or poetry after I got out of Yale. And so, therefore, I would tend to see a movie or any work of art as a whole. You know, Agee used to find some beauties in these films, some of which I don't think were there at all, but which he would have, if he had been making the film, they would have been there. You know.
Yes, this was in August, and I was in New York taking summer duty at St. Luke's Chapel. And early one evening, Jim Agee came in, and said at once, "Have you heard any news today?" And I said, "No, I haven't. I didn't get a paper, and I haven't had the radio on today, so I haven't." And he said, "You better get a good stiff drink. They have discovered the secret of atomic power and have made a bomb of tremendously destructive power and dropped it on Japan." And he was very deeply moved. He wrote, by the way, the cover story for Time on the atomic bomb. But he was much impressed by putting this enormous amount of destructive power into the hands of human beings. And so was I.
Time magazine, August 1945. The greatest and most terrible of wars ended this week in the echoes of an enormous event. The rational mind had put into the hands of common man the fire and force of the sun itself. When the bomb split open the universe and revealed the prospect of the infinitely extraordinary, it also revealed the oldest, simplest, commonest, most neglected, and most important of facts, that each man is eternally and above all else responsible for his own soul.
America's motion picture producers, deploring the activity of the Hollywood Communist Group, cited for contempt by Congress, let Association President Eric Johnston voice industry repudiation of the radical.
We will forthwith discharge or suspend without compensation those in our employ, and we will not re-employ any of the 10 until such time as he is acquitted or has purged himself of contempt. Nothing subversive or un-American has appeared on the screen, nor can any number of Hollywood investigations obscure the patriotic services of 30,000 loyal Americans in Hollywood who have rendered their government invaluable service in war and in peace.
I can't see how any man could, under such circumstances, hold Congress otherwise than in contempt. I doubt if anybody in Hollywood now will even dare to breathe loudly. But if anybody can do anything, I count on John Huston.
I'd written Agee a letter. He had reviewed a picture that I made during the war when I was in the Army. I did a picture called The Battle of San Pietro, which is a combat documentary. And he wrote a review that was so deeply understanding and sensitive that I addressed him in a letter. It's one of the few times I ever did that to a critic. Mm-hmm. And he answered. He appreciated my appreciation, mm-hmm. and looked forward to a meeting sometime. And then he
got in touch with me after I was out of the Army and had made a couple of films, notably Treasure of the Sierra Madre, and said he'd like to come out and do an article. So we went on a shooting trip up in Idaho, and Jim had a big time on that. I became very fond of it. He didn't shoot. He didn't shoot a gun. Well, he said at the time that he wanted then to leave reviewing, to leave criticism, and he had a deep and abiding love for motion pictures, and so I said, well, how about doing a picture with me? And said he'd like nothing better. The first one I did, why? The African Queen.
December 1950. Dear Father, I'll be staying out until late January working on a script with John Huston, The African Queen. If everything works out right, it could be a wonderful movie. If much works out wrong, it could be lousier than most. The work is a great deal of fun. I haven't read a book since I've been out here. I see a lot of people and like most of them. Compared with most of the intellectual literary acquaintances I avoid in New York, they are mostly very warm-hearted, outgoing, kind, happy, and unpretentious. The nicest kind of company, except at home with best friends.
We worked quite hard, and we were also on a kind of health regimen. We get up early in the morning and play a couple of sets of tennis, have breakfast, and then go to work. Work through until lunchtime, lay off for a couple of hours, and then work again for 2 or 3 hours, and another 2 or 3 sets of tennis, dinner, and after dinner we'd work. And I would write a section and give it to Jim, and Jim would write and give it to me. Most of what Jim wrote stayed as Jim had written it, and most of what I wrote, why, Jim rewrote. So the collaboration was a one-sided one, I'd say, and much to my benefit.
So they were out on this ranch in California, and Houston, as I say, Houston was in a reformed stage, and you know, slept and ate and played tennis and so on. I mean, he was really building himself up. Well, Jim thought this was all very fine, except that when Houston went to bed by 11 o'clock or something reasonable like that, then Jim started to work. So then he'd work all night through, so then at 6:30 or so they would start playing tennis. And that was just too much.
Jim was forever bringing more pages. He was doing an enormous amount of work, and I didn't see how he could manage to turn so much work out. And then I discovered that he was working at night and getting very little sleep. He was a night man, and a lot of what he was doing in the daytime was to please me. It wasn't all that long afterwards that he had his first heart attack. I remember after he'd had his heart attack, we were alone in a room, in the curtains drawn and so on. This was 2 or 3 days after the heart attack. And Jim said, could I have a cigarette, John? Would you give me a cigarette? And I said, no, Jim, I can't do that. I said, you know, you're not supposed to have cigarettes now. And Jim said, well, I'm not going to change my way of life because of this. I said, well, you've got a lot of friends that wish you would. And he said, give me a cigarette. And I said, no. I said, Jim, it wouldn't be fair to the doctor. He thought about that, nodded. That's right. Didn't ask anymore.
In 1952, Jim wrote the screenplay for The Bride Comes to Yellow Sky for Huntington Hartford and played a small comic role in the film as the town drunk.
Saloon, Marshal. Don't do nothing I wouldn't do.
Don't you do nothing I wouldn't do is more like it. Lock yourself in right after meal times.
You can trust me, Marshal.
Don't need to. I done told Laura Lee to keep an eye on you. So long. Be back in a couple days.
Give my howdy to the gals in San Antone.
You can do that when you get out. I ain't no hand for it.
I don't know, Marshal. Tell me, still waters run deep.
Not even a small beer?
Not even that. It's high time you got back and locked yourself in jail. Jack Potter's treating you white. It's up to you to treat him the same way. Now get along with you.
Treat me a whole lot whiter if he'd get back when he said he would.
He ain't but a day late.
A day's a long time when you spend it in jail.
Oh, well, read them magazines he give you.
Done read 'em 4 or 5 times. Get part of it. All that bang, bang stuff. Howdy, stranger.
Howdy.
I love Jim's looks. Of course, Jim didn't give a damn about his looks. It might have been the same shirt that I first met him in that he wore the last time I saw him, or the same necktie. And his clothes just assumed the shape of his body, and one felt that if they were put on a hanger, well, you might mistake them for Jim himself. As far as his physical self is concerned, I mean, his teeth missing, they'd been knocked out, and it just never occurred to him to have new ones put in. I guess people had remarked on this to Jim and had said, "Why don't you, Jim?" so often that when he laughed, he'd hold his hand up. But going to a dentist would be going too far.
There were more movie projects that folded than movie projects that saw the light of day. And one of those folded movie projects was the guy who introduced him to Chaplin. He was then shooting Limelight. And again, Jim was at all the shooting. So then he'd want to know, he'd have Jim tell him what he thought about various scenes or things, this, that, and the other. And Jim would, of course, always tell him very honestly. And, of course, Chaplin never paid any attention to what he said. But it didn't matter. I mean, as far as their relationship was concerned, this was perfectly all right. Each knew that, you know, this was sort of a dance you went through.
I've probably spent 30 or 50 evenings talking alone most of the night with Chaplin, and he has been very open and intimate. Very interesting, to put it mildly, to see what a man of real genius is really like. Few, if any, mysteries or surprises about that. The roots are emotion and intuitiveness. The chief necessity is discipline. Well, I'm not getting a bit.
He had an idea, which I think would have really been a very good film, of a post-atomic world for a film that Chaplin should make with a return of the tramp as one of the few, if not the only survivors. And Chaplin liked the idea very much. It worked. I don't think it worked out more than maybe a third of the film, if that much. But he never did it. But he was very interested in it for a while.
So he actually started writing the script?
He started writing an outline. You know, not a real script, but all I remember is the shadows that had been burnt into rock by some atomic explosions. I mean, you know, the images. Since all Jim's scripts were incredibly detailed. I mean, a drop of water on a leaf, or, you know, I mean, everything was, and many directors don't like that, and then some of them do, who Huston did.
Oh, miss. Oh, have pity, miss. Oh, you don't know what you're doing, miss. I'll perish without a hair of the dog. Oh, miss. It ain't your property. Oh. Oh. Oh, what a head. Oh.
I hear the African Queen has turned out very well. Houston says he would like to have me write with him a picture a year, and that, if it only worked out, would be wonderful. I enjoy movie writing much more than magazine work, but I also very much hope not to move out here. I imagine it's middle age coming on, that I no longer feel at home in new places. The places I feel really at home are Tennessee and on our place up in the country in New York State. And out here, I just feel as if I were treading water. On the tragic scale of some of my friends who are really wrecked by it, I am not an alcoholic, but I am certainly a naturally hard drinker. After one drink, it's very hard for me not to take another, and after 3, it's even harder not to take 3 more. And after that, I'm apt to lose count and stop caring how much I drink. Considering that I might be dead or an invalid, it doesn't seem like much to cut far down on drinking, smoking, or exertion. Yet I'm finding it hard to do.
I mean, he was constitutionally unable to seriously consider moderation or not doing what he wanted to do. So this really never really dawned on him. I mean, he never thought of himself as an invalid in the first place. You know, I mean, it's temperamentally, it's just simply totally unsuited to that.
What kind, did he make efforts at it?
Well, I take a few steps at it, like smoking less or drinking less. But it would never last very long because he'd completely forget it.
Yeah, I never saw Jim drunk, by the way. I know he did get drunk on a few occasions. And once drunk, I understand, he was deeply offended by some remark that I'm sure was offensive, and took a man who was quite powerful himself and stove him against the wall. One of the few times that Jim ever displayed temper of that kind. But Jim was utterly congenial and wanted, and in some way inspired the hope on your part that the world could come to terms with itself.
This is an unwritten letter. The effort is to just speak it into a microphone. The job I was doing was one I believe would interest you. I wish that we could spend an evening, I could go over the screenplay I wrote about it. It was about Paul Gauguin. And my sense of how to write about him was not as the criminal romantic that he's often set up, but as a man whose vocation was like a lure set out by God. That everyone has a different lure, and his was a very deep passion for painting, and that it'd take him the rest of his life, from when he first felt that vocation very deeply, to find that it was not the real thing even, but only the lure, and that all it was trying to teach him was to be as absolutely faithful to his own soul and his own being as he could, and that he find out the price of that as he went along. And there's a good deal of it that I feel very well about, that I wish I could show you.
When you come right down to it, a religious sense of life is at the heart of all of Agee's work. Sense that we do live in a mysterious, very mysterious universe. That the human life is constantly under the shadow of death. These sort of overpowering convictions stand behind everything that he did.
But one of his letters to me, I remember he said, well, sometimes I think that nothing will satisfy me except to return to religion, perhaps what I was brought up with. At other times, I'm equally certain that I shall not. But of all persons I've ever known, he was one who could weigh and see different angles of situations, different angles from which we might view a situation. Say, yes, this is so, but we must take account of this other fact also. And to some people, some persons, he would be exasperating. They'd think, make up your mind and say, yes, yes. And he'd say, yes, I accept this, but on the other hand, here is this that you must be thinking of also.
New York City, 1955. Depending on what I turn out to be capable of, I might go to Ireland to work with Houston on Kipling's The Man Who Would Be King, or might write a film for Williamsburg, or might finish a novel, or translate a play by Cocteau, or again might write a movie script about Quakers during the Civil War, or might adapt a novel called The Way West. So I'm less at a loss for work than for choice and for time, and the question among them of money, and of what I can afford to do for little or no money. I've been better the past week, dropping by and large from an average 12 to 17 attacks per day to an average 6 to 8. At moments, I wonder whether those who go as I do for a full life don't get their exact reward, which is that the full life is full of crap. At other moments, I realize equally well that this is what life is all about. In any event, God bless you.
Do you think he was satisfied with his life?
No. And I don't suppose he would ever have been, but he did produce quite an output, after all. But he would have liked to do much, much, much more and take various of those subjects and to go on with them. He was very much interested in human life, in human lives, in his own life. And here is the little sketch of, well, the death in the family. That narration of a few days in a boy's life. But I'm perfectly sure that he would have liked to go back to, say, time of his great-grandparents and get all the information he could about those and infer more. Then his grandparents and certainly his parents, and then about his own birth and so on. And you could have had an autobiography of 50 volumes, I suppose. Those who have gone before, backward beyond remembrance and beyond the beginning of imagination, backward among the emergent beasts and the blind, prescient ravenings of the youngest sea. Those children of the sun, I mean, who brought forth those, who wove, spread the human net, and who brought forth me. They are fallen backward into their graves like blown wheat, and are folded under the earth like babies in blankets. And they are all melted upon the mute, enduring world like leaves, like wet snow. They are faint in the urgencies of my small being as stars at noon. They people the silence of my soul like bats in a cave. They lived in their time as I live now, each a universe within which for a while to die was inconceivable, and their living was as bright and brief as sparks on a chimney wall. And now they lie dead, as I soon shall lie, my ancestors, my veterans. Then there are those who come within living memory. My mother's father's father, whom she revered and of whom she has told me. I think well of him and was burdened by his name, but I never knew him. I doubt I shall ever have occasion to tell my children of him. With this generation, he vanishes from the memory of the human race. And only the exceptionally good or able or evil survive in memory longer